Hey, it's State of State. We got your Nittany Lion update. It's a football discussion with Tom and Justin, so kick back and press play.
With former Penn State and NFL defensive back Justin King, I'm Tom Hannafin. This is State of State. Please like, comment, subscribe, rate us, and turn on notifications. Follow us on social media at State of State Pod. Comment on our YouTube channel. And if you haven't done so already, you can become a member of our YouTube channel. For just 99 cents a month, you can get all upcoming episodes of State of State, plus our entire members-only playlist, ad-free, commercial-free. Hit the join button on our homepage or follow the link in the description of this podcast. State of State is presented by BetOnline. BetOnline continues to be the world's most trusted betting platform and your number one source for online betting. From the earliest odds to in-game live betting, BetOnline provides you with constant real-time odds in action and the ability to watch the games as they happen, with the largest selection of odds on everything from football to the NBA, college basketball, the NHL, and even UFC. Head to betonline.ag today and don't forget to use our promo code BELIEVE, that's BLEAV, for your welcome bonus on your first deposit. State of State is presented by BetOnline. The game starts here. So the Orange Bowl is set. It's Penn State versus Notre Dame. That's going to be on Thursday, January 9th at 7:30 p.m. Eastern on ESPN in Miami, Florida, the semifinal of the college football playoff. I'm Tom Hannafin. I'm joined by Joe DeLeone of the Ruffino Joe Show, also does coverage of Notre Dame football for Bleacher Report. And as mentioned on our social media channels in the past few days, State of State has eclipsed over 1 million downloads. We thank all of you Penn Staters and football fans who have tuned in and made that possible. And I want to tell all of you that would not have been possible without the efforts of Joe DeLeone, who has helped make this show something special in front of and behind the camera for many years now. So, Joe, I want to thank you for that because we wouldn't be here without you. And this actually just works out really well. And that I was talking about this when I was like, oh, would you want to come on and talk about the game? Like, I didn't know, obviously, who was going to win, Georgia or Notre Dame. And you've grown up a lifelong Notre Dame fan. Your dad went there and you follow the team. You cover the team. So this just kind of worked out perfectly. And it is a match made in heaven. It's this really cool matchup of very similar teams. What's your macro perspective on this matchup in the Orange Bowl?
Well, you just hit on there like very similar teams, and structurally the way that these teams compete, the way that they win. It's crazy that this is what we're going to be seeing in the Orange Bowl, and especially just the historic nature of both of these football programs and the footprint that they represent in the country, that they have been national championship and national brands that have been recognized across the entire United States, but they haven't returned to that national championship glory, it feels like, in some time. So that they're going to be competing with one another. They're evenly matched. This is going to be a competitive game compared to the other matchup between Ohio State and Texas. To know that Penn State or Notre Dame will be representing the other side of the bracket, I think is awesome, that we're not just throwing into the mix, your typical Georgia, your typical Alabama, that it'll be a resurrection in a way of brands that have been needing a little bit of a boost.
It just means a little bit more for these brands, I guess. Pun intended entirely. What was your feeling on Notre Dame's victory against Georgia in the Sugar Bowl? It looked like the back half of that game was like Notre Dame had control of it. Georgia certainly had their chances to get back in it, but the way that Marcus Freeman orchestrated this game, the way that Riley Leonard played the rushing game, the defense from Notre Dame, this just was a very solid performance from them altogether to come out against a Georgia team that, you have no Carson Beck. It's not the same punch that Georgia has presented in the past, not necessarily the scary athletes at wide receiver and tailback that you're used to, not the same talent at offensive line that you're accustomed to, but still, again, two very evenly matched teams in that game alone.
Yeah, I think the big aspect of that game that stands out the most is the way that Notre Dame won that game, was that they played their brand of football. Great special teams, fundamentally sound defense. And then if you chip away enough on defense, you might give up a couple big plays here or there. You completely take away your opponent's run game. You're going to get a turnover. You're going to get a big sack. Notre Dame, to win that game, needed a drive with a short field. They needed a defensive or special teams touchdown. That is what has been their calling card this year. and one that hasn't been effectively recognized nationally by other conferences and other teams because they hadn't played anyone. They played a very non-competitive schedule. Even getting to see Indiana in the first round was one of the least competitive games because there was just a talent gap. To do this against Georgia was super vindicating for Notre Dame fans because the whole year you're watching and seeing Notre Dame and thinking, man, they have athletes at every single position group on defense. And even despite the fact that they're down multiple key starters due to season-ending injuries, we're talking about Jordan Botelho, we're talking Boubacar Traore, Riley Mills, who went down recently, Benjamin Morrison, who could be a first-round pick at corner in the upcoming draft. They've had all these young guys. They've had Leonard Moore and Christian Gray at corner, and players like Bryce Young, who is a true freshman. The way that they're able to step up all of these young guys that are just going out there and balling on defense, it's what I think makes a lot of Notre Dame fans optimistic for this future of this team, that it's a young nucleus that's producing all these impactful game-shifting situations.
So Notre Dame able to clear Georgia in the quarterfinal. On the other side, Penn State beats Boise State. The 6 seed takes out the 3 seed. There's been a lot of discourse about the teams that got buys. I don't necessarily buy into that too much, but that was a better Boise State team than I was anticipating to see on the field. I thought the way Ashton Jeanty did everything humanly possible to try and get Boise State through that game was impressive. I think the world of him as a talent, and it just kind of looked like a bad matchup altogether for Penn State's defense versus Boise State's offense. And that if you could take away Jeanty, you put the entire game on Maddox Madsen in the passing game, and that's just not the way that they're structured. That's just not the identity of that offense. It's exactly what Penn State wants to do, is take away the run and get after the passer. What were your feelings on Penn State defeating Boise State in the quarterfinal?
I think you really perfectly illustrated how their defensive approach, naturally for like the casual onlooker, you're watching the first half and going into the third quarter, and you're kind of thinking, man, they're giving up a lot of big plays to Maddox Madsen, but it was all part of the the grand scheme. The grand scheme was, we're not going to let Ashton Jeanty break any tackles and to jet away for a 25, 40-yard gain or a 50-yard touchdown. The swarm tackling was nuts in that game. It was one of the best defensive, it's one of the best defensive performances that I've seen this entire playoff. The way that they just were flying to the football. He had a couple of loose runs, but overall to hold him to 3.5 yards per carry and no touchdowns is a true recognition of the athleticism on that Penn State defense and also the approach. And what that then set up was, Maddox Madsen, he was going to have those wide open opportunities to connect with his receivers, and that long touchdown reception that he threw to his tight end that was so wide open. But they knew eventually he was going to get a little overconfident, and that eventually that would lead to an interception. It would lead to him taking sacks because all of the pressure in the box was going to hit home and was going to get to him. The one only thing, and maybe I'm being a little bit overly critical, but Penn State listeners on Ruffino and Joe kind of agreed with Blake and I when we talked about this. I just didn't love the offensive approach by Kotelnicki in this game because what was working, Katron Allen was having big gains. Nick Singleton was having a ton of huge gains late in this game. And it felt like they were trying to play hero ball with Drew Aller. It felt like they were trying to drop him back, 5-step drop. We're going to turn you into this, top 5 pick that everybody's lauding you to be, and you're going to take shots downfield against a weak secondary. Penn State doesn't really have the receivers to win in those contested spots consistently. You're going to win by getting the ball to Tyler Warren. You're going to win by getting the ball to your running backs. It felt like it was so against the grain of what had gotten them this far and what has made, Drew Aller hyped up as much as he is.
The first quarter, it felt like Penn State was going to run away with it against Boise State. So credit to Boise, the way that they countered and got back into the game. I agree with you. The way Kotelnicki was calling the game in the second and third quarter, I have phrased it as getting way too gimmicky. And this offense is at its best when it can kind of lull you to sleep with the stuff that Kotelnicki has talked about, the vanilla stuff.
Yeah.
Run the damn ball. That's fine. And then if you want to pull out a gadget, every, 6th, 7th play or something like that, I was like, cool, you'll get away with that and you'll have more success with it. The issue is when the gadgets come out every other play. and you're leaning more on the passing game, and you're putting yourself behind the sticks almost unnecessarily. Like, it kind of feels like when you're playing a video game and you're getting down to the end of the second quarter, you're like, I'll chuck it a bunch. In third quarter, you're still kind of in that mindset. And then you have to wake up and be like, hey, let's put this thing away. And that's when Penn State got back to Katron Allen, Nick Singleton, big carry, the explosive there to score the final touchdown to really seal it for Penn State. That's my only real worry with this. And I feel like Notre Dame in the Orange Bowl is going to have the exact same approach that Penn State had against Boise State and that Georgia attempted to do against Notre Dame. Stop the run and put the game on the passing game. I'm not saying that Drew Aller is incapable of beating Notre Dame with his arm, but this offense works better when it's not all on him. And there's been examples through this season where the USC game, that game was largely on Drew Aller and Tyler Warren to play Superman ball and get Penn State over the hump. Looking at this, let's start with Penn State's offense against Notre Dame's defense. Where do you think there's going to be the pluses and minuses for both sides?
The way that you just opened that up with talking about Aller, I think is the keyest, the biggest key for this game overall. It's the quarterback play on like who is the bigger game. If Gunnar Stockton, who had actually played very well, and I think that it's one of the things that's going to be missed in the Sugar Bowl, he was able to connect with his guys. He was able to find some really premier, those athletes that they have a receiver that don't have great hands or consistent hands, but he was able to get some big chunk plays that kept them relevant throughout to be placed in scoring positions. With that being said, Drew Aller is going to find success. He is going to be able to connect on those splash plays because Notre Dame is going to replicate what they just did against Georgia. They are going to run man coverage on the outside on an island with two very good man coverage corners against a Penn State receiving core, to be honest, is weaker than the Georgia one. Probably have better hands, but the Georgia group is just more better athletes that were able to do the things that they did in that game to keep it within range.
And it's Penn State had its issues with drops against Boise State.
Right. And trying to set up situations that just aren't going to be there against Notre Dame because they're so good in those tight contested spots with Moore and with Gray. The real way that they're able to win, I think, on the offensive side of the ball for Penn State is, can they start to crack through running the football? Notre Dame has been great at defending the run, but they have not seen a challenge like this of two really gifted backs of Nick Singleton and Katron Allen. They play off of one another so well. As long as, the way that I see this, as long as Kotelnicki doesn't get too gimmicky, as you just described, and it's just, all right, we might not score in the first quarter. Maybe we only have 7 points at halftime. But if we just keep trying to come back to this, a lane's going to open up. Nick Singleton's going to break through. It's almost like what Notre Dame tries to do from time to time when their running backs are healthy and they're not getting knocked out of games, is that they're just hoping eventually Jeremiah Love's going to break free. Jadarian Price is going to break free. That feels like that's where they could potentially win.
It's that war of attrition. For me, I see an advantage for Penn State in the A gap and the B gap. Yeah. I love the interior of Penn State's offensive line, and that's no knock on what their current tackle situation is. Granted, a backup right tackle in Nolan Rucci, who's played well ever since Anthony Donko went down. Drew Shelton's been steady at left tackle. The interior of Penn State's offensive line, one, is enormous, and two, has played very, very well this entire season. Sal Wormley, Nick Dawkins at center, and Vega Ioane, who is just a dump truck moving in real time. Those guys in the interior, I think, against what is a weaker defensive tackle and interior defensive line for Notre Dame, that's the point, and I defer to you, who's watched all of Notre Dame's tape this year, especially with Riley Mills going down. Yeah. Is that a situation where it's like, hey, this is a problem if they just hammer this for 4 quarters?
It definitely can be, and that's what I'm getting at here with Notre Dame not seeing a matchup like this. They had the benefit of this last game going up against a team in Georgia that struggled with run blocking and also had a lot of inconsistencies from the running back play. Trevor Etienne and Frazier were not always getting these big spark plays when they needed them to. They're not the same level of explosive as Singleton and Allen can be when they play off of one another. I think it is a legitimate concern, definitely for Notre Dame's case, not having Riley Mills. Luckily, Howard Cross, who went down for a brief stint in the game, he went back in, so that's good for Notre Dame's end. But that's where the biggest hole is on Notre Dame's depth, is that they're down multiple defensive linemen and that they're kind of turning to some other playmakers to step up in that situation. They need to keep coming back to the same theme, not get too cute with it. Just know that you're able to win between the tackles and try to keep running up the gap. Eventually, like we saw against Boise State, Singleton's going to rip away and he's going to have a 60-yard touchdown.
In terms of Drew Aller and Tyler Warren, do you think one or both of them will have to play that superhero type ball? And also, if you're Notre Dame, who covers Tyler Warren?
That is a great question because we saw a lot of linebackers on Georgia's tight ends in the Sugar Bowl. We saw a lot of Jack Kaiser and Drake Bowen trailing and tracking the tight ends. They've got multiple that they could turn to that aren't the same level of dynamic as Tyler Warren and game-changing as Tyler Warren, but they're still highly recruited kids that are good athletes. That's probably the matchup that we're going to see because Notre Dame does not want to vacate the box of having to throw defensive backs in there against a team that's probably going to come out trying to run the football. That is going to be for what we're talking about of like, does Tyler Warren need to step up and have a big game? I don't think he needs to go crazy for, 150 or anything like that, but knowing that he is that consistent option in the red zone and he is that consistent option on third down when Drew Aller needs to connect with somebody, he's the one of the two that I think needs to step up and have the biggest game because if they're connecting and they're in rhythm, he's one of those few holes that on Notre Dame's defense, they don't have a tight end eraser. And very few teams have been able to figure out a way to erase Tyler Warren from a game.
Xavier Watts in and out of the lineup against Georgia, that would be somebody that potentially they're looking at to at least be one of many that are keeping an eye on Tyler Warren. We've seen a lot as Penn Staters through the season, people trying to double Tyler Warren and then just play man everywhere else. To your points about the deficiencies at wide receiver for Penn State, that's been an issue the entire season, unfortunately. Before we go any further, I want to talk to all of you about Future Fans Sports. If you've ever tried to help a kid understand football, you know that it's really hard. It's difficult enough talking to a full-grown adult who doesn't know the game and trying to explain the little nuances of the sport because there are plenty of them. It's a complicated game. Future Fans is a new brand that helps little kids become big sports fans through storybook-led activity boxes that help them understand the sport. You can introduce the core concepts of a sport in ways that make sense to a kid. For example, instead of explaining something like downs in football, which Justin, I know that is it's difficult when you're explaining that to a lay adult, for instance, there's this beanbag toss game that has things like 4 tries and 6 points embedded into it. And then later the storybook connects all of that to football. You've dealt with this. You work with people of all different ages trying to spread the message about the game. This Future Fans product, I think, is a really nice tool for parents, especially.
Any way to engage with your kids, whether it's about becoming a fan, whether you want to work in the sport, whether they want to participate in the sport, learning the context of the game from the rule standpoint and the birth of the different reasons why the game and the rationale behind the different rules really brings in a different level of context for younger kids and for adults, to be completely honest, because you can't learn a wealth of knowledge without the basics. And I think this, Future Fans really provides that great educational foundation for any sports fan, participant, or avid learner.
And you're a dad, and this was invented by dads, and they figured this all out for the rest of us, which is awesome. This product is designed for kids age 4 to 8 and the football fan adult in their life. It's only $49.99 at futurefans.com, and you can get a 15% off discount with the code Penn State, all one word, PENNSTATE. Again, that's 15% off with the code Penn State at futurefans.com, so you can unlock a lifetime of memories around sports. State of State is a proud supporter of Blue White Outfitters. Blue White Outfitters was created as a retail shop meant to highlight the confidence, competitiveness, and fearlessness of the elite athletes found throughout the history of Penn State University. Check out their Lockdown U and Lawn Boys merchandise today. All sales from Blue White Outfitters directly benefit Penn State student athletes. Also, official State of State merchandise is available now. Support the show and grab State of State t-shirts, hoodies, hats, and more. Visit www.bluewhiteoutfitters.com today. Flipping sides of the ball, Penn State's defense against Notre Dame's offense. The number one question Penn State fans have going into this game is, will Abdul Carter play? And also, if he can play, how healthy is he? My worry for this is Abdul Carter's posted stuff on social media that he's doing what he can to be able to be ready for this game. And that's wonderful. But I've seen so many instances in college football, pro football, where a star player who is a game changer like Abdul Carter is playing hurt and is not playing as well as they possibly can, no fault of their own. Putting them in the game can often be more of a detriment than it can be an advantage. So that's just kind of a big question. We won't really know how that goes until things get kicked off in Miami. But on paper, how do you feel about Penn State's defense against Notre Dame's offense?
Carter's health is definitely the biggest catalyst for Penn State in this game, because if he plays as good as Notre Dame's tackle play has been, he's still somebody who's going to go on to be a top 5 pick and has played like it this entire year. He is a game changer. He is somebody that if Riley Leonard is not paying attention to his surroundings, could get blasted by him and it leads to a fumble. Where Penn State has a lot of similarities to Notre Dame for what we just talked about. They have the talent along their defensive line. Zane Durant's a tremendous player, and the linebacker play that we've seen from this group, despite not having like any really big name linebackers in the scope of the country, but just getting constant contributions, even in pass coverage, the way that they played against SMU, they're going to be primed to be able to slow down Notre Dame's rushing attack. That's where the biggest swinging point on the other side of the ball, and we keep talking about how similar these teams are, is can Notre Dame break away and can they produce a big play? Can Jeremiah Love get a 50-yard rush that he wasn't able to produce against Georgia because he ended up being a little bit banged up? He's dealing with a little bit of a sickness. Jadarian Price ended up having a couple of plays. The biggest part of all this, as I mentioned earlier with the Sugar Bowl recap, is that can Penn State prevent Notre Dame from playing with a short field? And I know that sounds kind of crazy to say, but your best defense in this game is going to be your offense grinding out the clock, playing responsible and just strong decision-making and not giving up turnovers, because the Georgia game was close. And then just like that, in an instant, right before the half ends of all situations where Georgia didn't even need to try and move down the field really quickly, a strip sack sets up a touchdown that then sets up a kick return for a touchdown. And it felt like the game was out of hand for Georgia to get back into it. So as indirect as that sounds, you can't end up in these situations if you're Penn State to set up Notre Dame's offensive success. They're not often a team that marches down the field against good defenses. They just don't. They didn't do that against Georgia until the end of the game when the attrition started to kick in. It's all about, are you gifting them possessions where they're starting at the 30 or 40-yard line?
Notre Dame presents an interesting challenge for Penn State in that, there was a chance Penn State could have seen this against Ohio State at home back in November, but it just didn't really come to fruition. Will Howard stayed in the pocket a lot more. I believe he had like roughly 10 carries in that game, but they didn't commit to, we're going to run the hell out of him. Like Riley Leonard, 14 carries for 80 yards rushing, and then only 90 yards in the pass, but 15 of 24. He had a touchdown along with 32 to kind of contextualize his rushing effort, and was the leading rusher for Notre Dame against Georgia, 5.7 yards per carry. This wasn't a huge offensive output from Notre Dame, to your point, and I believe Penn State presents more problems defensively than Georgia. To me, this game is going to be won in the turnover department. Penn State, Boise State, a very different opponent than Georgia, granted, but Penn State comes away with 4 turnovers. It was nearly 5, 2 fumbles by Ashton Genty, 1 that he recovered. 4 turnovers, it's nearly impossible to come back for. And Penn State had built so much of a lead that they could kind of F around there in the second and third and still manage to get the victory. It was still a narrow margin of error for Notre Dame against Georgia in the Sugar Bowl. And according to our friends at Bet Online, the spread is in favor of Notre Dame by 1.5 right now. That's how close this feels. This feels 50-50. It could really go either way. Whichever team stops the run and wins the turnover battle, I feel like is going to win this thing. My question to you is, if Penn State is somehow able to negate the running game of Notre Dame, and that's such a different thing, because if you run Riley Leonard, then it's like, all right, you got 10 blockers versus Penn State's box. That's going to be a challenge. But if you somehow put the passing game on Riley Leonard and Notre Dame, like, how does that actually work out for the Irish if Leonard's forced to throw them to a win?
I think that's what a lot of teams have tried to do, and that's certainly what Glenn Schulman of Georgia tried to do, who's Georgia's defensive coordinator. Mike Denbrock Notre Dame's OC, that was seemingly the goal at the beginning of this, was try and see what we could produce in the passing game. They were trying to see what they could find and what they could get. And Riley Leonard's never the guy that's going to go for 304 touchdowns. He's just never going to be that player, because he's a far better athlete and he's able to scramble and extend the pocket. I think that what it comes down to for Penn State in this situation is, like, are you able to effectively spy him? Because if he's dropping back and they are forcing him to throw the ball more, we saw in this game that despite Denbrock throwing him into these situations early, that he was going one read essentially and then trying to scramble and pick up yards. And there seemingly was not really much attention to trying to track him and to keep an extra eye on him and have a linebacker just waiting for him the minute that he vacated. So keeping him at bay is a little bit more, complex than just wondering, like, hey, what does he do as a passer? Because when those passing lanes don't open up, his instincts have been so good lately that he's known when to pull it. But the other part about this, and I think what 90 yards isn't reflective of great passing prowess, and the way that they played against Indiana isn't reflective of that prowess either. But the reemergence of two key playmakers in the passing game has been able to help Riley Leonard at least connect in some third down situations that haven't been there for the first half of the season. It's Mitchell Evans, who came off of a ACL tear last season and was seemingly a shell of himself for 3/4 of the year, recovering from that ACL, and now looks like he's back to form of just being a steady, consistent option. And Jordan Faison, the lacrosse player who is the shiftiest receiver for Notre Dame, who was battling an ankle injury all year, was non-existent, was unimpactful because receivers can't cut when their ankles are in severe pain. And he has this rest for the playoff that now he's starting to show a little bit of that juice, that they use him on end arounds and they're also using him in the quick game. So him surviving, and if Penn State does say, Riley Leonard beat us through the air, those are the two guys that they need to be paying the closest attention to. And it just kind of bodes for Notre Dame's favor that when we're in those tight man situations, that a big body like Mitchell Evans could come down with the ball, or a guy like Jordan Faison who's shifty could separate.
Penn State has had their issues in their more challenging games this year, notably the losses to Ohio State and Oregon, and then also I'd say against Boise State in this past round, is that when Penn State has played against teams that are committing to running the football and then are using timely play action, saw how Ohio State schemed a lot of guys open in that game in Happy Valley, and that's how Jeremiah Smith and Carnell Tate got their scores that afternoon. It wasn't necessarily this barrage through the air like we just saw in the Rose Bowl, where Oregon got obliterated by Ohio State in that department. Penn State just needs to play extremely disciplined defense to make sure that you don't get lulled to sleep by the running game, regardless of the source that it comes from, and then falling asleep on the back end. That's something that Penn State's pretty good about. It's a pretty solid secondary, and it's been a really nice symbiotic relationship. But coming back to the point you were saying before, Abdul Carter, what's his health? How's he doing? Is he 100%? Is he able to play to that game record level that we've seen from him this season? Deny Dennis Sutton, his fellow defensive end, was banged up at the conclusion of the game against Boise State. Amin Vanover came in and played like his hair was on fire. He was outstanding. Is he Abdul Carter? Is he Deny Dennis Sutton? I don't think so. But at the same time, this is a great opportunity for him to try and break out and be like, no, I'm as good as these guys, and we're not going to miss a beat in this department. So those are the huge questions for me in this. Final question I'll pose to you. The head coaching matchup, I think, has so many great storylines with it. First of all, to see two black head coaches competing in the semifinal, and we're guaranteed to have a black head coach finally in an FBS national championship game in college football, is a wonderful thing. Marcus Freeman clearly has galvanized Notre Dame football ever since the departure of Brian Kelly. It's a wonderful story to see what he's done in just 3 years. It's very impressive. Meanwhile, James Franklin, the ridicule on him, and I'll be the first person to raise my hand and say, yeah, that's Penn State under James Franklin doesn't win the big one, doesn't beat the big teams. Well, they've been winning some big games consistently here and performing well in bigger games. I'll point towards the Big Ten championship game against Oregon. So Penn State continues to inch closer. 10 years now at Penn State for James Franklin, and this is the greatest opportunity this program has had during his tenure. My question to you is, when it comes to game management and decision-making, when it comes to one possession crunch time opportunities, who do you trust more, James Franklin or Freeman?
Man, that's a really tough question because, we have a large sample size of what James Franklin has done and a very small one for Marcus Freeman. And I think that we need to go back to the NIU loss to kind of look at how this Notre Dame team has just completely changed. One of the things, and I was always a bit of a skeptic of Marcus Freeman, and I regret doing that because of how quickly things have shifted in the right direction. One of the biggest criticisms of him was, one, crucial in-game decision-making. We know what happened against Ohio State last year where there weren't enough guys on the field. Just overall overseeing an organization of the program wasn't to the level that you would hope for a college football playoff winning team. The other aspect, and one thing that I pointed out a ton, is it felt like in matchups where they needed to come out hot and they needed to just immediately eliminate an opponent, they were very flat. They were unfocused. Marcus Freeman on the sideline would always seem just very placid and almost sometimes look nervous in situations. And since that game, and one of the things I talked about after NIU is that he needs to completely just scrap and change everything. And they needed to go on to win playoff games, I think, for the fan base to feel more comfortable about him going forward. And I think everybody feels more comfortable because now we see the team coming out firing on all cylinders. We see the amazing first defensive possession that they have. And then lastly on that is that he's fired up all the time on the sidelines. He's being aggressive. He's no longer on his heels. And to answer your question with all of that in mind, I go to the in-game decision-making of Marcus Freeman with the play that they were willing to call and pull off on a fourth down situation where he runs on the punt team, runs the first team offense back out there, and tries to get Georgia to jump off sides. That to me is a completely different in-game decision-making that we have not seen from him. So I take Marcus Freeman there because he has just had this rapid maturation as a coach. He has had an improvement and a change in his philosophy that it has produced these results. And as much as James Franklin has gotten better in these past few years, I would argue that there's still a little bit of, slowness to them in the way that they start games. It's, kind of still in line with what the negative had been for Marcus Freeman. So I take Freeman in that vein.
Yeah, the slow starts have been a concern for the bulk of James Franklin's tenure. I was encouraged by the fast start against Boise State, and you could argue that's why Penn State was, like I said before, able to kind of fool around there in the second and third quarter and then just close out that victory. I will defend James Franklin in that I have seen improvement in that department this season. I'll point towards the victory at Minnesota. Fourth down, punt attempt, you fake it, you run Luke Reynolds, and if you don't do that, you don't seal the game in the end. And we're not talking about Penn State in the college football playoffs. So some ballsy decisions that have occurred this year, and there's been incremental improvement in terms of those choices that are made for analytics or other reasons. I've seen improvement by James Franklin, but considering all the things that we said about this game, field position, turnovers, time of possession, that just plays into this being not exactly the last team with the ball wins, but those critical coaching decisions are going to decide this. And that's where there is reasonable doubt for the way that James Franklin has done that in the past. So how that plays out, we're going to find out on Thursday, January 9th in Miami, Florida. Check out Joe DeLeone on the Ruffino and Joe Show, wherever you get your podcasts. They do a great job. And of course, if you're trying to learn more about Notre Dame football through the eyes of Joe DeLeone, check out his work on Bleacher Report. Joe, thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate it.
Of course, it's always great to catch up, Tom, and I'm sure that this game, or I hope it lives up to the hype that we're putting out there, and I'm sure it'll be a great contest.
Yeah, I'll be texting you for the entire game.
I'm warning you now, you might get some slow responses if Penn State starts to pull away.
That's fine. Thank you all for joining us. Penn State, Notre Dame, the Orange Bowl, the college football semifinal in Miami on Thursday, January 9th. Thank you all so much for joining us. This episode and our entire library of shows is available now on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever else you get your podcasts. Please like, comment, subscribe, rate us, and turn on notifications. Follow us on social media at State of State Pod. Comment on our YouTube channel. And if you haven't done so already, you can become a member of our YouTube channel. For just 99 cents a month, you can get all upcoming episodes of State of State, plus our entire members-only playlist ad-free, commercial-free. Hit the join button on our homepage or follow the link in the description of this podcast. State of State is presented by Bet Online and by Blue White Outfitters.